Dear all, I think we'll start. On behalf of Fritt Ord and Institute for Social Research, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this seminar. My name is Arnfinn Midtbøen. I'm a researcher at Institute for Social Research and the co-head of the Fritt Ord project, the Status of Freedom of Speech in Norway, of which this seminar is part. The title of the seminar is The Freedom to be Racist, and it's borrowed from the book authored by Erik Bleich, who is today's main speaker. Erik is professor of political science at Midtbøen College in Vermont, and one of the world's leading scholars in comparative research on free speech and hate speech legislation. Broadly defined, Erik's current research focuses on race and ethnicity in West European politics, and he has an impressive academic track record, including articles on topics such as hate crimes, political violence, Islamophobia, immigration, and integration. I first became aware of Erik's work in 2012 when I attended a conference in Boston where he presented the Freedom to be Racist book, which had been published recently. I remember being struck not only by Erik's intellectual clarity, but also by the scope of this project. Research on free speech legislation is normally limited to one country and based on the contemporary situation. Erik's book, on the contrary, is truly comparative. It compares the policies that the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and other liberal democracies have implemented when forced to choose between preserving freedom and combating racism. And it is impressively historical in scope, mapping out how these policies have developed from the 1920s to the present. This is a major research achievement. Admirably, in his book, Erik also engages in the difficult normative question of how liberal democracies should strike the balance between principles of free speech on the one hand and the fight against racism on the other. And as such, I believe his work has great relevance for present debates in Norway, which tend to center on where the line between legitimate and illegitimate expressions should be drawn, and on how and to what extent hate speech and racism could and should be countered. Before I give the floor to Erik, let me say a few words about how we proceed. After his talk, we will get two comments, one from Anne Sender and one from Mohammed Abdi, whom I will introduce later. Erik will then get the opportunity to respond to these comments, and the three of them will have a conversation here. And finally, I will open the floor for questions and comments from you. So please just take notes and comments. Note your questions and comments that arise while we go on. Okay, that being said, Erik, I'm very grateful for you coming to Oslo. I look very much forward to your talk. And I look forward to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnfinn, and thanks to the Fritt Ord Foundation for inviting me here. Anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, these are pressing issues in Europe these days. Over the past few years, we've seen the rise of far-right parties like the quasi-fascist Golden Dawn in Greece. You can see its symbolic allusion to the swastika is not exactly subtle. There's been an intense debate in France about the meaning of the quenelle, which is a gesture coined by French comedian Dieudonné, who's also been in the news a lot lately. He claims it's simply an anti-establishment gesture, but others see in it an anti-Semitic allusion to the Heil Hitler symbol from Germany. His shows, Dieudonné's shows, have been banned in France, so he's quite a controversial figure. And his friend Nicolas Anelka, who you see up here, those who are not fans of the English Premier League, he's an English Premier League striker, quite a talented one, and after he scored a goal, he imitated Dieudonné's quenelle and was sanctioned by the British Football Association for doing so. There's also an ongoing debate about the hate crime concept across Europe. Some see it as logical and just that people should get an additional punishment for their racism when they engage in a hate crime, and others see it as illogical and even nonsensical or perhaps dangerous in a liberal democracy. So my talk today really circulates around the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in liberal democracies. And I do this by focusing on the term racism, the freedom to be racist. And so just a quick word on what I mean by that. I mean, very broadly, racism traditionally conceived, but also anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, these are two of the primary forms of racism that we see in many places in Europe today. So it's a broad definition of racism. And my focus is on liberal democracies, especially in Europe. But I think that what's distinctive about many of the European liberal democracies is actually most easily seen when we bring in the United States, when we juxtapose what's going on in many countries in Europe with the strategy and the procedures of the United States. So I'll talk about the US as well. My research addresses three main questions. First, how much freedom do countries grant to racists? And to answer this question, which is a kind of factual, empirical, historical question, we can look at three domains. The first is freedom of speech, which is much on the lips of people across Europe. But also, I think it's helpful to compare freedom of speech to freedom of association and freedom of what I call opinion as motive. So these three things basically mean, can people say racist things? Can they group together with other racists and act as a group? And do they have the freedom to act upon their racist motives without fear of being punished for their racist opinions? We can also look at the cross-time and cross-national variation in the way that liberal democracies have dealt with these issues. All liberal democracies value freedom. All liberal democracies, at least embodied in their political leadership today, oppose racism. But how have they balanced these two core values? I think understanding the answer to this question tells us something about the nature of liberal democracies these days. The second question is, what explains these cross-national differences? European countries are not all the same. How do we understand variations among them? And as I've suggested, it's also important to recognize that most European democracies, liberal democracies, as different as they may be from one another, there's still a major difference between them as a group and the United States on the other hand. So we want to try to look at why these differences exist. And the short answer here, I'll give you the longer answer later, but the short answer here is there's no simple answer. Right? There's not one simple thing you can put your finger on to explain why the United States and Europe are different or why these different European countries are different. So I'm going to give you a kind of subtle and nuanced answer shortly. The third question I'm going to tackle today is, how much freedom should liberal democracies grant to racists? And I think I had to go into this terrain, even though I'm not a political philosopher, I'm a comparative politics political scientist by training, because I'm not sure how I could write a book like this without going into the question of, well, what do we do with this information? Right, so I wanted to touch on this in the book, and I'll touch on this today. How should we balance these two key values in our societies? All right, I want to start with the historical point. This is the first main point. Since the end of World War II, there has been a shift in the balance of public values, away from protecting freedom and toward fighting racism. And this is true in every European country that I know something about. Prior to World War II, just to give you the grounding and set the point of comparison, prior to World War II, there were a few laws in Europe that could have been used to punish racism, and they were used, however, very sporadically and very partially and with very limited effect. They were weak, they went unenforced. When did this begin to change? This began to change not in the immediate aftermath of World War II, not in most countries. They began to change really in the 1960s. Between 1960 and 1972, first Germany, then Britain, then France passed laws against racism and against different forms of racism. And I think it's easiest to communicate the transition here by looking at one country in a little bit more depth. So I'm going to talk about Britain, comparing the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s. In 1958, the owners of the Scala Ballroom in Wolverhampton decided to refuse entry to non-blacks. By the way, this is Wolverhampton, a picture of Wolverhampton in the 1950s. So you can kind of get the picture that if you lived in Wolverhampton in the 1950s, you definitely needed a place to go dancing, right? Because that's what your town looked like. And so they said, we have a business here, and blacks want to come and dance here, but if we let the blacks in, then the whites won't want to come. And so we are refusing entry to blacks, and we're claiming this is legitimate business interest. There was a lawsuit, and British courts ruled that the color bar, as it was called, was indeed a legitimate business interest, that it would harm the business bottom line of the Scala Ballroom if you allowed minorities, particularly blacks, into the ballroom. And this is a classic example of facing a trade-off between upholding freedom and punishing racism, where the decision was to uphold freedom. Right? This is the freedom of commerce, the freedom of business, the freedom of people to choose who to let into their bar or ballroom or cafe and who to keep out. And this seems like such an anachronism, so it's worth reminding us that as recently as 2012, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul suggested that maybe we should go back to a system like that in the United States. Right? Maybe we had sacrificed too much freedom in the fight against racism. He quickly walked that statement back and backtracked in light of the strong media pushback that happened. But it's worth noting that these sentiments still exist today. They are an anachronism, but they're not completely out of our realm of discussion. Less than 20 years after the Scala Ballroom case, Britain had passed 3 rounds of race relations legislation in 1965, 68, and 76. Each one of these pieces of legislation further restricted the freedom to be racist. Now, British racists cannot discriminate in granting jobs or promotions or housing or bank loans or in allowing people into pubs or bars or ballrooms. That's all now strictly illegal. And these laws passed in this era did not just prohibit racial discrimination, they also prohibited racist speech. It's illegal in Britain to incite racial hatred with statements that are intended to or likely to stir up hate. Moreover, since the 1970s, Britain has passed even more restrictions on racism. In 1998, it created provisions against what it calls racially aggravated offenses, which basically means if 2 men are running at each other, ready to fight, and they each swing and punch each other on the nose at the same time, but the first one in the attack shouts bloody N-word, and the second one in the attack shouts bloody racist. Both of them will be punished for the punch, but the first one will get an additional punishment, an additional penalty, could be jail time, for the racist motivation in the attack, whereas the second one will not. So this is, I think, putting it in these terms makes it clear for some people why this could be considered problematic. For some people, that's not problematic at all. That seems logical and right. But for others, they start to wonder, well, they both punch, so why do you get more of a penalty for your opinion, for expressing your opinion in the act of the punch? Nonetheless, it is illegal to do this, or rather, I should say, you get more jail time for the racist motive. And this is a classic hate crime, a supplementary penalty for a racist motive. All right, so that's the story of Britain. What about Germany? And this is just to give you a flavor of some of the differences among European countries in the post-war era. In some ways, the German policy trajectory is actually quite similar to the British policy trajectory. Its anti-racist laws and policies have grown in number and in strength since the 1960s. But Germany is quite different from Britain in 2 key ways. The first is that it's gone much further than Britain in restricting some forms of racist speech. German laws in the 1980s and 1990s explicitly forbid Holocaust denial. Just like in Austria, where David Irving spent over a year in jail, it's illegal to say that the Holocaust never happened in Germany. Germany prosecutes and convicts people every year for Holocaust denial. Most of these cases result in a small-scale fine, but there are some recidivist offenders who insist on pushing this point year after year, time after time. After being convicted a few times, they wind up generally with jail sentences, or if there's a particularly aggravated version of it, they can go to jail for the first time. So it's rare to go to jail, but it does indeed happen. And this is a highly controversial restriction on freedom of speech, and it's done because German legislators think that it is a particularly important or particularly hurtful and harmful form of racism in the German context. Second thing to know about Germany is that compared to Britain at least, Germany has been kind of a foot dragger when it comes to passing and enforcing laws against racial discrimination and against hate speech. In fact, it was sued by the European Commission in 2003 because it hadn't met its commitment to pass anti-discrimination provisions by that deadline. Finally, it passed a law in 2006 against racial discrimination, but it has been, by all accounts that I've been able to follow, hardly enforced at all. And Germany has steadfastly resisted calls from the EU and from the Council of Europe to pass penalty enhancement provisions for racist hate crimes. So the German pattern involves going further than Britain in some respects and not as far in other respects. But the overarching pattern in both countries is towards fighting racism and restricting certain kinds of freedom in order to do that, trading off certain kinds of freedom in favor of more robust laws against racism. Most of the European countries have followed exactly this pattern. Not all of them have Holocaust denial provisions, not all of them have hate crimes provisions, but all European countries have expanded the restrictions on racism and in doing so curtailed certain forms of freedom. Bringing the United States in here provides, I think, an important contrast to the European cases. The US has really gone against the grain and in dramatic fashion by expanding the freedom for racist speech. Americans, being Americans, and actually even sometimes non-Americans, believe that we have always had full-fledged and perfect freedom of speech in the United States. They believe the First Amendment of the Constitution really is a bulwark against restricting freedom of speech. And they believe it so much that often they ignore their own history in order to support that kind of belief, because it's not quite right. Until the mid-1920s, free speech issues were actually left up to the states to decide. And some states did pass hate speech laws, including Illinois. And in 1952, as late as 1952, the Supreme Court, in its Beauharnais decision, upheld the criminal conviction of a Chicago man by the Illinois courts, who passed out pamphlets and decried in public the, quote, aggressions, rapes, robberies, knives, guns, and marijuana of the Negro, end quote. And the Supreme Court looked at that case. It was a close decision. It was a 5-4 decision. But they essentially said, if we have a law against libel, then there can also be provisions against group libel, what many people in Europe, many European lawyers would call defamation. In effect, the effect of the decision was basically to put the United States in the 1950s in almost exactly the same place that European countries would get to starting in the 1960s. Right? So there were many similarities between the US situation in the 50s and European situation starting in the 1960s. However, just at the moment where European countries were moving to further restrict racist speech, the United States went in the opposite direction. The Supreme Court issued decisions in the 1960s and 1970s that cumulatively gave racists the protection to say virtually anything they wanted to say in public. And I'm thinking in particular here about these decisions, the New York Times v. Sullivan decision, Brandenburg v. Ohio, and the Skokie decisions of 1977 and 1978. And the racists still have the right today in public to say virtually any racist thing they want. As long as you're not threatening violence or inciting people to direct violence, which follows immediately from what you say, you can say virtually anything you want in public. At the same time, what you realize when you look closely at the United States and European countries is that the outcomes are, at least in some ways, internally inconsistent. So you may think it's a sort of instinctive reaction to think, oh, well, Americans just value freedom more than Europeans. Most Americans do think this, but they're wrong on this point. Why? Because when it comes to looking at the freedom of racist opinion as motive, the U.S. was actually a leader in penalizing racial discrimination, which it began to do in the 1960s in a serious way at the federal level. And it was also a leader, primarily at the state level, beginning in the 1980s, in punishing hate crimes. So it was perfectly willing to give up certain kinds of freedom in favor of punishing certain forms of racism, just not other kinds of freedom in respect to other kinds of racism. So my argument here is that there's an overarching historical pattern among liberal democracies that applies to most of them. Since the end of World War II, they have gradually restricted the freedom to be racist. And this pattern has moved at varying speeds and has taken varying forms in different places. The one major exception has been the United States, where the trend has gone in the opposite direction, towards increasing the freedom to be racist, in the United States in terms of hate speech in general. But overall, the pattern is clear, and the historical excavation that I've done, I think, shows this fairly clearly. The next question is why, right? How do we explain these outcomes? And in particular, I'm going to focus here on a couple of major cross-national differences. And here I want to say what I alluded to in the beginning. There are some explanations of these differences that seem highly plausible, but that don't quite work, right? So it may seem at first glance that the larger minority population you have in your country, the more stringent protections you're going to have against racism, and the more you may trade off certain kinds of freedom. That it's a story of political lobbying. But remember that the major European countries and the countries that I looked at, pretty much all of them passed most of their legislation in the 1960s or the 1970s, which is to say before ethnic minorities were a substantial part of the population, and certainly before they were a substantial part of the voting population. Whereas in the United States, ethnic minorities have always been a significant portion of the population and voters, and yet that's the country where the trade-off went the opposite direction, where they increased the freedom to be racist. So that doesn't quite work. The second intuition that a lot of people have is that there's something about the laws and maybe the Constitution, right? In particular, as I mentioned before, the U.S. Constitution seems to many people to be the obvious explanation of why freedom has to be upheld in the United States. But, right, we've already talked about this. The Constitution did not prohibit the decision in Beauharnais that upheld a hate speech law in Illinois. So it's not clear that the Constitution in its own does enough work to explain the different outcomes. And there might be a third story here, which is a kind of political culture story, which says, in general, Americans are more in favor of freedom. In general, Europeans are more in favor of protecting human dignity, that these are reputation, right? That these are sort of major cultural differences. And here, I think the answer is that doesn't really explain a lot of what's going on either, because of course in the United States, as I've shown, people are willing to trade away freedom when it comes to discrimination, anti-discrimination laws, and when it comes to hate crimes laws. And Germany, the country that's often cited as the one that upholds dignity and reputation more than any other in Europe, is the one that has been the foot dragger in providing anti-discrimination and hate crimes laws. So these stories aren't sufficient. And I'm not trying to argue that these things don't matter at all. I think these things probably matter a little bit, each in their own way. But there are too many exceptions to the rule for any one of them to be a really compelling explanation of the cross-national differences that we see. So the argument I'm going to make today is that the best explanation focuses on what I call context and confluence. By context, what I mean is there are moments in time where there is a higher potential for policy change. In the U.S. policymaking literature, these are often called windows of opportunity. Other political scientists call these critical junctures, and what this means is relatively short periods of time during which there's a substantially heightened probability that agents' choices will affect the outcome of interest. That's a very jargoning way to say there are certain political moments where change is more likely, and there are other political moments where it's just much less likely. By confluence, what I mean is there are different factors which would not necessarily be important on their own, by themselves, that sometimes come together at these particular moments in time to push for certain kinds of changes. These may be long-term trends, like demographic shifts over long periods of time, gradual changes in public values surrounding the merit of racial equality. They may be short-term, what are sometimes called focusing events, an economic shock or intense media coverage of some act or some incident. And when these factors come together, they can influence the emergence of a context that's favorable to change. And the more of these factors that conflude, that's not a real word, but I think you get it, and the more intense they are, the wider the window of opportunity opens for certain kinds of changes. But, I mean, of course, change isn't guaranteed, and the extent of whatever does happen doesn't have to be dramatic. Policy outcomes are also influenced by additional factors like what are the political incentives of politicians in power? Are there viable solutions to the policy problems that countries are confronted with? these sorts of things. So arguments like the one I'm making suggest that the outcomes that we see and the differences across countries are the products of national contexts that result from the confluence of multiple factors at a particular point in time. And I'm going to illustrate this with two examples that represent kind of the opposite ends of the free speech spectrum. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Germany and the implementation of Holocaust denial provisions, which are just kind of at the extreme end of what most people think of as limits on freedom. Right? These laws do not exist in every European country, and they're highly controversial in many countries that have them. And then I'm going to compare this to the U.S. extension of protections for racist speech. When the Federal Republic of Germany outlawed Holocaust denial, it wasn't because powerful minority groups had been lobbying for it. It wasn't because there was anything in the Constitution that suggested that they should. And it wasn't because German political culture only had a tenuous attachment to free speech. The German story actually unfolded in two stages. First, it's helpful to know that people have actually been denying the Holocaust basically since the day the Holocaust ended. But Holocaust denial as a widespread intellectual movement really took off in the 1970s. And this issue arrived on the German agenda in 1978 when an appellate court ruled that saying the Holocaust was, quote, a Zionist swindle perpetrated on Germany was not against the law. Right? So the German courts are saying we are protecting freedom of speech in this instance, right? Which goes against the simple political culture story. The Federal Court of Justice overturned this ruling in 1979, but it left a kind of ambiguity about whether all of these sorts of statements were actually going to be seen as illegal or whether some of them were legal. And this state of legal uncertainty came at the same time as a spike in racist activity in the early 1980s. And that prompted the center-left coalition at the time to propose a law that would have created a new crime of rewarding, approving, denying, or minimizing the National Socialist genocide. That's the 1982 proposal. This was going to be, in other words, a kind of pure Holocaust denial law. But the government fell 2 days after it submitted this bill in 1982, and the center-right coalition at the time had reservations about this law. Eventually, the party compromised on a kind of watered-down version that banned insults, and it's important to recognize that word insults, directed at anyone persecuted as a member of a group under the National Socialist or another violent and arbitrary dominance. I'll tell you this kind of secret backstory to what that last part means, because you read that and you think, what are they talking about? Well, the right-wing folks were actually more concerned about Germans who had been expelled from East European territory in the aftermath of World War II, the kind of settling of scores. So their constituents, their voters and leaders, that was sort of their sop to the, I wouldn't call it the far right, but at least let's call them the more conservative right components of their party. So this compromise meant that it was against the law to deny the Holocaust, but only if it was meant as an insult to Holocaust victims. And that raised some more legal ambiguities, because if the statements were made out of the earshot of Holocaust survivors, then who was insulted? And if the statements were made after all the Holocaust survivors had died, then there was nobody to insult. So in other words, this solution generated a new kind of problem, a new kind of legal ambiguity. And this one would have increasing implications over time as more and more Holocaust survivors died. Things came to a head in 1994. In March, the Federal Court of Justice seemed to resolve the ambiguity of the 1985 law. It ruled that simple Holocaust denial, what the court called a bare denial of the gas chambers, was not punishable by law. In other words, here you have German courts saying, in the trade-off between protecting freedom of speech and punishing a certain kind of racism, we tilt towards protecting freedom of speech. Not the outcome that many people might have expected from German courts, but they did. The problem was, however, this created a scandal. Newspapers declared the decision legally correct, but politically devastating. They feared it would ruin Germany's reputation around the world. And again, timing is important here, because the decision happened when neo-Nazi groups were resurgent in a reunified Germany. in the early 1990s. Attacks against foreigners in places like Hoyerswerda, Rostock, Mölln, and Solingen, the names of which might actually resonate with some people in this audience. They became kind of headline memory cities that stand for this kind of racism. These were in the news quite a bit at the time, and Germany was on the front pages of the world's newspapers for all the wrong reasons. So to make matters worse, after making this decision, the High Court returned to the lower court to say, okay, now you guys have to issue the final ruling in this case. By the way, the Holocaust denier in this case was Günther Deckert, who was the leader of the NPD party, the far-right party in Germany. And when the lower court released Deckert, it went out of its way to praise him as a family man who was simply complaining about, quote, Jewish pretensions about the Holocaust. So you can understand that this created another scandal, and in fact the judges on that court were put on emergency medical leave. Right? They must be crazy. That was sort of the intuition there. And these events, the intensity of these events coming in that moment of time and all coming together at a head, and for those reasons, pushed through a new Holocaust denial law in October of 1994. And this law penalizes approval, denial, or downplaying of genocidal crimes committed under the Nazi regime. In other words, it codified Holocaust denial as illegal under all circumstances. So in both German stages, it was the combination of a few key factors at a particular moment in time that allows us to understand the outcomes that we see. Legal uncertainty or a mismatch with public will about what could be punished, a spike in racist activity, and international spotlight trained on Germany. And it's not just the combination of these factors that drove the outcomes, but also their intensity. So in the first time period in the 1980s, there was pressure, but it wasn't very intense. And the right-wing parties basically said, we need to delay this for 3 years, we need to change it, we need to soften it. But in the second time period, the pressure was incredibly intense. So intense that it was actually the right-wing coalition of parties that passed the straightforward Holocaust denial law that they had objected to just a dozen years earlier. So explanations that focus on context and confluence, I think, are also quite important for understanding what happened in the United States and why it is the exception to the rule that I articulated in the first part of the talk. And here I'm just going to give a kind of abbreviated version of the American story. Why were protections for racist speech expanded in the 1960s and 1970s? Again, just to set aside some arguments that may seem plausible, it's not because minorities were weak in this time period. Just the opposite. They were strong and getting stronger in the 1960s and 1970s. They were highly mobilized. It's not because the Constitution ruled out curbing racist speech. We've already talked about Beauharnais, so you know that that's not the explanation. And it's not because Americans are so attached to freedom that they couldn't imagine curtailing it. They had just done it in the 1960s through anti-discrimination laws. These explanations that might fit the bill are not compelling. To understand the outcomes, you have to understand the context of the era. In particular, southern states at the time were busy deploying laws to restrict speech and associations in order to restrict the power of especially black civil rights activists in this era. So there were laws against libel. There were laws against fighting words. There were laws against disruptive assemblies. There were laws against dangerous associations. The kind of laws that many European countries use to restrict racist groups and racist speech existed to some extent in the United States, but they were used by white supremacists to suppress black civil rights workers' civil rights activists' objections to what was going on in the southern states. So the Supreme Court basically said, okay, it's in blacks' interests, and blacks are telling us that it's in their interest. Civil rights workers were saying, we need more freedom to say things that are deemed to be outrageous by southern white supremacists. And the Supreme Court became their ally and instituted these kinds of protections for wide open free speech. The cost of that, or the trade-off of that, was you have to also allow racists to say what they're going to say. Right? The law had to be race neutral. So the trade-off was there, but it was deemed to be in the interest of actually civil rights workers, and it fit with the interests of the liberal Supreme Court at that time. So it was the confluence of the intense racism that attempted to restrict minorities' free speech and association, minority calculations about their interests, and a liberal Supreme Court that drove the outcomes in the United States. And this confluence of factors in the 60s and 70s created a context for policy change. And it was this that actually cemented the freedoms, the freedom to be racist, the freedom to speak racist things, that we so strongly associate with the United States and that most Americans think that they have always had. So perspectives that focus on context and confluence are a compelling way to understand outcomes in these two critical cases. They're most compelling when there is a major shift in multiple factors at one particular moment in time. Right? A legal decision opens up uncertainty, and there's international pressure on Germany because of racist events, or racist actions in the southern states come to a head at the moment minorities are agitating for more freedom. I just want to give one final example just to show that this is not just related to two things. In Britain, after 9/11, the government wanted to crack down on terrorism. And at the same time as they wanted to do this, they wanted to signal to their Muslim constituents, their Muslim populations, that these laws that they were going to pass, which were in some characterizations a bit draconian, were not targeting the Muslim community. So what they did is they embedded within an anti-terrorism act an extension of the hate crime law that they had passed in 1998, an extension to cover Muslims, essentially an extension to cover religion as an aggravating factor in attacks. So it was a way to say, this particular moment in time, we are going to restrict the freedom to be racist against Muslims in particular, to offset the other kinds of restrictions that Muslims are going to be facing in the near future. Okay. So far I've talked about how much freedom countries have given to racists and about why they've gone in different directions. But how much freedom should we give to racists? And my argument here is that we have to keep three basic things in mind. Three basic things for you or me or any individual to keep in mind. The first is, what is the normative context? And by here, I don't mean context as an explanation for outcomes. Here, I mean, can context also justify certain outcomes in particular places at a particular moment in time? And I think the answer is yes. Right? Holocaust denial laws, I'm not a big fan of Holocaust denial laws, certainly not in every country in every time period, but I think that they can be most easily justified in Germany, more easily justified there than in the United States. And I'm not the only person that applies this kind of context-dependent normative filter to understand where these laws should be applied or not. Deborah Lipstadt, whose name may be familiar to most of you, David Irving famously sued her in a British court for her book Denying the Holocaust. She's no fan of Holocaust denial laws either, but she said, the exceptions I would make are Germany and Austria, where I can understand why they would have those kinds of laws. The second thing to keep in mind is, what is the effect of different types of laws? If anti-racist laws are passed, do they radically restrict important freedoms? Most Americans would say yes, especially for free speech laws. But I think the fact is that in Europe, many European countries have had these laws for long periods of time. They do restrict certain forms of racist speech. All countries that I know of have used these laws at least a little bit, some a little more. But citizens are not being thrown in jail in large numbers, or really even small numbers, anywhere. In fact, very few people go to jail. And most Europeans do feel like they still have a lot of free speech. In some cases, however, I think the answer is yes. There is some restriction of freedom, particularly for me, the place I see this most clearly is in hate crimes laws. Hate crime laws, they can be applied differently and are in different places, but the landmark case that established the right of American jurisdictions, states in particular, to punish hate crimes was a case called Wisconsin v. Mitchell, where there was an aggravated battery involved with a racist motive. And aggravated battery in the state of Wisconsin carried a maximum penalty of 7 years. of 2 years. But if you have a racist motive involved, it creates a maximum penalty of 7 years. And in this case, the perpetrator was sentenced to 4 years. So for me, that seems like actually quite a big restriction based on racist motive. I don't have a problem with hate crime laws in general, but when you're talking about 3.5 times the jail sentence, that seems to me to be perhaps going a little far. The third element of the normative equation is how to balance your principles. Right? Most of us, and I'm assuming it's true for everyone in this room, love freedom and hate racism. But we need some guidelines for figuring out how to balance these values. And here I elaborate on John Stuart Mill's harm principle, that the only justification for limiting liberty is to prevent harm to others. But stated like that, it's actually still pretty vague, right? What kind of harm, how much harm to who? And in my view, harm to individuals has to be measurable, specific, and intense. It has to be the loss of a job, the physiological reaction that's caused by fear of bodily harm, post-traumatic stress disorder because you've been personally attacked in a racist way. The harm to society has to be essentially threats to social order. And this might mean an increased probability or acts of violence. It might also mean creating an atmosphere of hatred that drives a wedge between different segments of society, particularly those where there already exists a wedge, where you're deepening a rift, an important rift within society. Causing offense or simply being objectionable, in my view, is not a great enough harm to invoke a legal response to hate speech. There are other kinds of responses that societies do engage in, which I think are fully appropriate, but offense cannot be a standard, in my view, for generating a law or a prosecution. I'm happy to elaborate on how I view specific cases in Q&A. But I think, for me, the most important thing is the process of reasoning. So thinking through context, effects, and principles as a way to figure out how to balance these values in any particular case that we're faced with. And one final word. I recognize that where I come out on any particular case, any particular incident, is not likely to be exactly the same place that you come out, having assessed exactly the same set of facts, having looked at the context and the effects, engaging your own balance of principles. So the final piece of the puzzle that I'm concerned about has to do with liberal democratic citizens resolving our differences in the political sphere. And so what I've given so far are some guidelines for how individuals might think through any particular case, but that doesn't get us to an answer for how societies might do this. So for me, I think the judiciary has an important role to play. It has played an important role when societies go too far out of the bounds of either protecting freedom at all costs of severe racism or fighting racism at severe cost to certain kinds of freedom. But for my money, I think elected bodies at the local, state, regional, national, European level are the democratic organs that are best suited to solve major value conflicts in liberal democracies. And I think that we need to have some faith in the democracy part of liberal democracy. I think this rule of thumb applies not just to balancing the protection of freedom and the fight against racism, but also to all major value conflicts. This, I think, shifts the burden back to citizens. To think, to reason, to argue, to lobby, to mobilize, to try to generate the kind of outcome that we think of as best for our liberal democracy. And so for me, that's the best way for societies to decide how to balance core values. Because in the end, almost all of us want to protect freedom and fight racism, and our challenge is deciding how to do that best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erik, for an impressive and wide-ranging talk. We'll have two comments to Erik's talk. The first one is Anne Sende, who is now Secretary General of the Council for Religious and Life Stance Communities in Norway. Anne is also an author, the former head of the organized Jewish community in Oslo, the Mosaiske Trossamfunn, and the recipient of the 2014 Fritt Ord Prize for her contributions to public debates about anti-Semitism in Norway. The second commentator is Mohammed Abdi, master student at the University of Oslo, columnist for the newspaper Morgenbladet, and one of our new public intellectuals, engaged in, among other topics, the role of Islam in Norwegian society, immigration and integration, anti-Semitism, and free speech. I look forward to hearing your comments and reflections, so Anne, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is way over my head. But this week's exhibition in Oslo focused on Nobel Peace Prize winner of 1936, Karl von Ossietzky. It is, of course, appropriate for debating freedom of speech. Debating changes things. I begin to admit that my balance has moved towards more freedom and less restrictions in the last 3 years. Due to the terror close to home, the suffocating of free speech in Central and Eastern Europe, cartoonists jailed, hate against women, more segregated minorities and political privileges given based on racist policies in Europe. At the same time, I have worked and experienced free speech, the wild, racist, dehumanizing way in Sri Lanka, South Sudan, Palestine and Pakistan. So I'm just like many ordinary people the author described, often confused, indecisive, decisive and shifting from clean anti-racist to freedom absolutist, from case to case, country to country, feeling very guilty about it. When I first saw the book, which is with its tiny letters and the tight print, it was disheartening. However, being an ordinary, non-academic, but concerned citizen, the question of how to balance our freedoms is too important to leave only to the experts. People from all levels, both professional and amateurs, must exchange views from practical, legal and ethical perspectives. For me, being Jewish, and I believe for most of the members of my organization, the Council for Religious and Life Science Communities, the starting point for reflections about the issue of this book, the freedom to be racist, is morally grounded. There is a difference between right and wrong, and words are as dangerous as the sword. Of course, we know when our words cross the line. That's what we teach our children every day. The challenge today is that too many no longer care whether we hurt our neighbor with ugly words, despite extensive education programs in school. It takes more to fight it. Many of our members come from countries with regimes that care nothing about ethnic or religious minority groups, even though they have the most glorious written constitutions. Words mean everything or nothing at all, and religious leaders, often middle-aged men proclaiming to have God on their side, overrule both legislators and courts. Core events, often violent conflicts, have tightened laws and freedoms, not developed them. And yes, I admit that too much of morality sometimes can, despite good intention, undermine the law. The balancing act we all need to perform is indeed very, very difficult. This book helps us. I found I ended up reading for hours because the message of this book is easy to understand. The legal material is explained in a way that even most I can understand. It's exciting, and strangely enough, it gives hope. The author explains the long lines, the struggle and the improvement, and you believe it. In my view, the author fulfills the important 3 C's, which makes a text get to you: compassion, competence, and care. I like his compassion for unpacking the diversity of ways states and people deal with these intertwined issues of freedoms, speech and association, their motives and conducts. For his compassion, his competence of history and facts about different countries' development and experiences, using the law against discrimination, racism and hate speech. and his obvious care for protecting our freedom of expression without giving up on ethics, showing us that liberal democracies are capable of dealing with these challenges. He manages to take away the notion that we have to choose between sides, anti-racists and freedom absolutists, that there is only one correct and morally acceptable answer as to how we can deal with the dilemmas within liberal political systems. He argues that we should have limits to what a racist may say, and that we have already decided on such laws in most Western countries with a wide range of definitions and practices. How this actually matches the struggle to conform to the UN religion conventions is still unclear to me. Also unclear to me is how to solve the problem of all the silent voices in our society, voices that are silenced by the enormous amount of ordinary bullying, hurting and degrading speech that is sheltered in the grey zone of free speech. Some of us believe God gave humans free will and the ability to understand, ask forgiveness from one another and learn to improve. In the Jewish calendar, the 10-day period between the Rosh Hashanah New Year and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, is dedicated to focus on the words and deeds of the previous year. Becoming aware of the promises you gave too easily, the exaggerations you made of what the other really stands for, the rumors you told behind people's backs, the small lies and the insincere prayers. In order that we humans may strengthen our knee-jerk reaction to speak up and fight for what is right, we first have to develop resilience against our own meaningless statements and vaccinate ourselves against taking on the role of victims. We are responsible for each other, and democracy comes at a price. This brings me to the explanation about the Holocaust denial issue that have been sweeping through Europe for the past 40 years. Some say the moral authority of collective judgments about policy depends in part on the moral quality of the process by which citizens collectively reach those judgments. The law identified 3 types of Holocaust-based racism in the 1960s and 70s. 1, the glorification or justification of the events. 2, downplaying or minimizing the Holocaust. 3, the blatant Holocaust denial. The core argument of the court said, Holocaust denial did not deserve blanket freedom of speech protection because no one has a protected interest in spreading untrue statements. Simple as that. Many countries have since moved from specific to generic law on Holocaust issues, so that other groups and crimes against humanity and genocide are also covered. I support this development, as the London-based Jewish Policy Center did in a 2000 report. The last conviction of Holocaust denier David Irving in 2006 and the Muhammad cartoons of the same year pushed this issue to opposite sides, debating about whether to keep the law or not. In my view, each country has to decide whether to keep these laws according to their own historical baggage on the subject. It took only 3 years after World War II before deniers came forward and 30 years until any useful law was in place. In Norway and Germany, it was not until the mid-90s before we started talking about, in Norway, the faith of the Norwegian Jews at all. Not overwhelmingly moral, if you ask me. With rising anti-Semitism in Europe, explosive growth in hate groups, all with conspiracies about Jews, we probably have to continue to restrict blatant lies. The political and religious radicalization on internet towards the foreigner, the Muslim, the infidel, the women will require not more laws, but the courage to use and challenge the existing ones that we have much more than we have done today, at least in Norway. To debate the effects, make the penalty fit the crime, adjust and try again, and again, and again. Thank you.
Thank you.
sometimes it doesn't mean that I find the topic very boring, but I came from work and I've been fasting, so I'm a bit tired. So, so that's why I'm doing it. First of all, I would thank Erik it's okay if I use your first name, Erik Bleich. I don't know if I pronounced it right. I would thank you for your introduction, and it was actually, you went through all the book, but I recommend people who haven't read the book to read it too, so they will get all the details of the issue, the stuff that you were talking about. I want to start with something which is quite, when we talk about racism, I think none are for racism, except racists. But last week I read a news article, and this is from an incident in Norway, and there was this cab driver of, I think it was Pakistani origin, Norwegian Muslim cab driver, who was a victim of hate crime, where he picked up a customer who was probably very drunk, and sometimes we Norwegians say "fylla skylda," which means if you're drunk, you do stupid things because you're drunk. But I think that's too easy to excuse to use. But what happened is that he was attacked by this customer, and he was hit physically. And the customer said very racial slurs or anti-Muslim bigoted slurs like "I wish all of you Muslims dead" and so on. So when we talk about racism, it's quite important to understand that it's not only about words, it's also about actions. If it's about desecrating Jewish cemeteries or beating up a woman with hijab or killing a human being because of his belief, that which happened in UK, United Kingdom, old Pakistani Muslim who was going home from mosque and who was killed by Polish neo-Nazi in 2013, I think so. So we have to remember racism is also about actions, very violent actions. It's not only words or terms that we find offensive. The thing is that, Erik, what I find most interesting and intriguing with your book is that you are very, it's a very good book in that way that you try to explain very easy, as Anna said, it's very easy accessible to understand what you're talking about, but it's also, you give the context, both the historical, the social also, and you also see the past and the now. And I think that's what's good with your book, because you're not only focusing on the legal part or the historical part, what happened for 60 years ago, 70 years or 40 years ago, but you also look into how there is a continuity. What I find quite disturbing is, first when I was invited, I heard the title, "The Freedom to be Racist." Is there a freedom to be racist? There is. It's also a freedom to be a homophobe, freedom to be a misogynist. But what I think is more important, which, if you can call it a freedom, is the freedom to be anti-racist, the freedom to be a feminist, for example, or be against misogyny. And this part is more important because even though those people can have the right to be racists, and they can, to be honest, I think people who deny the Holocaust are a bunch of assholes. To be honest, I think it means that their history class teacher should be fired because these people must obviously have slept through during history class. But I think to deny them, to deny the Holocaust will in some way give them the role of becoming a martyr. Even though I agree with you and Anna that it's understandable in some countries like France and Austria, but also France, to be honest, because you had the Vichy regime, which was very anti-Semitic, I understand that those 3 countries have laws against Holocaust denial. I do. But I wouldn't understand if it was Norway. And that's not because because I'm a Norwegian and I want more freedom, but it's about the fact that there's a historical context behind these Holocaust denial laws. But when you start with, and this is something that I don't think you went into the book, if I don't remember right, if I'm not wrong. The thing is that, Erik, that a lot of people who are against laws on Holocaust denial, who wants as much freedom of speech as possible, who also use the term absolute. We have absolute freedom of speech, but that's not true. We don't have many of them. What I noticed in Norway, especially, I don't know how it's in the United States, is many of them use this. They use an argument which is quite not that good, to be honest, and they say that if I have more freedom of speech, if we have more freedom of speech, it would be easier to be anti-racist, for example. They would say to give more freedom will give all of us other who are not racist the freedom to talk with these racists and to try to refute them and condemn their writings and their speech and so on. And I have noticed this argument are primarily used in Norway, where you have 3 political parties, 2 of them are governing the country right now, who want to get rid of the only paragraph in Norwegian legislation, which is, it's in Norwegian, it's the so-called rasisme-paragrafen, which is the racism paragraph. It used to be 139, but now it changed. I remember, I'm not a legal scholar, but they use the argument that if we don't allow racist speech, and if we don't have too much, if we don't have more freedom of speech, it won't be that easy to be anti-racist or anti-homophobe or so on. But I don't get that argument, to be honest, because it's nothing that stops you from being anti-racist. You still have the freedom to be an anti-racist. The part that I want to go into, I don't remember how much time I have, Arnfinn can tell me, is when you said we have to trust the democracy part in liberal democracy. When you were talking about the United States, I noticed, Erik, that you didn't mention that when you asked how much freedom should we give to racists. Well, to be honest, in the United States, the racists have so much freedom that they can be a presidential candidate of one of the major parties, to be honest. It clearly shows that in the United States you can disagree with me, you can come far by being a very bigot. Donald Trump, as you all figure out now. So I, as a minority, I'm a huge fan of liberal democracy. As a Norwegian, I think it's one of the best forms of governance. But I have to be honest that I also understand democracy as Thomas Jefferson said, it's the right for 51% of the people to take away the right of the rest of the people, 49%. And my trust in democracy as a Norwegian citizen is very high, because in Norway we have checks and balances, just as in the United States, but when people can elect, which it's too early, I know it's too early to say, but when people like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen or what was his name, the one in Austria, when they can be elected or get very far to be elected, I think democracy is not necessarily a problem, but I think we shouldn't be naive to believe that everyone in that society is anti-racist, because that's not necessarily true. What I want to end with my introduction is that one of my favorite authors is Marlon James. I don't know if you heard about Jamaican. He won the the Man Booker Prize, not the National Book Award, but the Man Booker. He said that when we talk about racism, a lot of people are, of course, against it. But a lot of people don't necessarily call themselves anti-racist. That's the problem we have. And it's also the same with women's rights. A lot of people, and especially men, won't call themselves feminists. But I think there's a reason that we should call ourselves feminists and anti-racist, because not only to use it as a badge of honor, but also because it's important. So Marlon James, this is a very short clip in The Guardian, if any one of you want to watch it later. He said that none talks about being against his point is that we have to start not only being against something, but also for something. And what he means with for something is we also have to start being anti-racist. So he used examples like nobody says that I'm against rape, I'm not a rapist, so I'm against rape, but people also do something against that. They don't want a rape culture in their society, they speak against it. In the same way, they should also talk about racism, and they should stop being a non-racist and start being an anti-racist. Because I think that there's too many non-racists out there and too few anti-racists. That's one point. Lastly, but you actually mentioned the last point was PTSD and physical harm and so on. I think that people have to understand that. I think Jeremy Waldron have talked about the harm in speech. And there's also this in Harvard dangerous speech. I don't remember they're studying it. So people have to understand that words sometimes are not only words, but they can be harmful also, especially if you have a minority background or in some kind of way. Thank you.